everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight for the Science on Screen presentation of Rushmore. And as Colin said, I'm an assistant professor at WSU in neuroscience. And tonight we're going to talk a little bit about what Rushmore can tell us about the inner workings of the teenage brain. And before I get started, Colin mentioned this Science on Screen series is the result of a competitive grant that he applied for, so I want to give a shout out for that. And if you look at the map of the current grantees, you'll see that our Kenworthy Theater is the sole pin in the Northwest, and it's really in the company of iconic independent theaters across the country, so we should be really proud of that. Okay, yeah, let's go. All right. So today we are going to meet Max Fischer in Rushmore. He is a sophomore. He is extremely extracurricular and not necessarily that academic, as we will see. And he's a great depiction of adolescence, and we'll see through his relationships in the film, he really finds himself in this space between childhood and adulthood. And as you'll see, adolescence is this gradual transition between childhood and adulthood that spans roughly between 11 and 12 years old to start into our early 20s. And I want to highlight what is known as the adolescent health paradox. So interestingly, adolescence really is a peak physical fitness period in the lifespan, but it is accompanied by this increase in morbidity and mortality. So we see a 200 to 300% increase in mortality from childhood to adolescence, right? And what is driving that? So despite this physical health, we see that there's a major source of death and disability that comes from things like accidents, suicide, homicide, et cetera, risky behavior. And so the major source of this disability and death comes from what we can attribute to problems with controlling emotions and behavior. So that leads to the question of, is the teenage brain to blame for this health paradox? What's going on? So to introduce what's different about the teenage brain, I want to talk about a model that's been very influential known as the dual systems model. And it's going to highlight two important regions in the brain. First, we have the prefrontal cortex, which is important for planning, abstract reasoning, and impulse control. I like to think of this as cool cognition. If you know Star Trek, it would be the Spock part of the brain. On the flip side, we have hot cognition through a region of the brain called the ventral striatum. This region of the brain is important for reward processing and emotional saliency. So it is activated in reward anticipation and in response to outcomes, judging how good or bad an outcome was. And we can think of this as the Kirk center of the brain. And so behavior is driven by a push and pull between these two brain regions. And in the teenage years, this increase in sensation seeking and risk taking is believed to be driven by a preponderance of activity in the ventral striatum in the presence of an immature prefrontal cortex. And so this has led to this imbalance model where it's believed that the ventral striatum, or the Kirk part of the brain, matures sooner than the prefrontal cortex. And this lag means that the ventral striatum is able to drive behavior unrestrained by the prefrontal cortex. I want to highlight, you'll see diagrams like this, but there's only a direct anatomical projection from the prefrontal cortex to the striatum. But don't worry, there won't be a quiz on this afterwards. So the ventral striatum matures earlier than the prefrontal cortex, and it's believed that this imbalance leads to enhanced sensation seeking and risk taking during adolescence. And this white line is depicting that period of adolescence where the difference in the maturation between that striatum and the prefrontal cortex is greatest. And this is believed to contribute to risky business, risky behavior. So I've shown you this model, but what is the actual scientific evidence that's led to it? So when we talk about the late maturation of the prefrontal cortex, a lot of this data comes from looking at structural and functional imaging studies in human brains. What we're looking at on the right is a very influential study that looked at a process called gray matter thinning. So as you go from childhood, 5 years old, to 20 years old, the thickness of the cortex actually decreases. And when they look at the pattern that this occurs over the brain, we see that there's a back to front pattern, with this thinning occurring in the prefrontal cortex in the late teens into late adolescence. So this led to the idea that the prefrontal cortex is one of the last regions to undergo gray matter thinning and this maturation, which matches with the delay we see in the maturation of some of this higher order cognitive control. So what's the evidence that the ventral striatum may be overactive in adolescence? This comes from functional imaging studies that show that using fMRI, we see an increased activation in the ventral striatum during risky decision-making tasks during reward receipt. And this is higher in adolescents compared to children and compared to adults, and predicts risky behavior in these sorts of tasks. So those two pieces of evidence together suggest that we have an overactive ventral striatum, and we have a still maturing prefrontal cortex. And this could explain this more risky behavior during adolescence. But I want to go back to Max Fischer, an iconic quote, "I wrote a hit play and directed it, so I'm not sweating it." And what I want to highlight is when we talk about the adolescent brain, it's often in the context of being pathologized. The adolescent brain is vulnerable, it's immature, the prefrontal cortex is defective. But when we look at the behavior of adolescents like Max Fischer, he's capable of writing and staging complex plays. People often discover their passion for academics or arts or sports during this period of time. Those type of endeavors require planning and a lot of investment of time and effort, et cetera. So it seems oversimplified to say that the prefrontal cortex is not online and isn't working. And I'd argue that we underestimate the adolescent brain in this way. So what does the latest data say? So recent work has really tried to carefully characterize when prefrontal cortical dependent cognition matures, and it's been found that it actually plateaus sometime in late adolescence. So it's not that it isn't online and available yet. And so what the data suggests is that late adolescents have access to adult-like prefrontal cortex function. It's just recruited under different circumstances. It's more likely to be recruited in service of short-term rewards under the influence of peers and under heightened social and emotional states, right? So it's there, it's just being driven under different circumstances. So I want to say that the adolescent brain is not defective. It is adapted and wired to explore during this transitional phase of life. So we see childhood, adolescence, there is this maturation, but it's adaptive and important to sensation seek and explore and take some risks as you transition to adulthood. And adulthood is a period of specialization. We see the cubicles for the work environment, and just a plug that Office Space is playing tomorrow at 7 p.m. All right, so in the last minute or so, I just want to come clean about something that might have been misleading from the talk so far. I've been talking about humans, but my lab actually works on mice, okay? And so you might be asking, how can we study the teenage brain in mice? Well, I would argue that if you look across the animal kingdom, a lot of these traits of adolescence are conserved. This enhanced sensation seeking, risk-taking, maturation of cognition, etc. So we use mice so that we can delve into the causal mechanisms that drive adolescent brain maturation and go look at a much more fine, detailed scale. So some of the questions that I'm interested in my lab is understanding what are the factors that shape and schedule the timing of adolescence. We see that there are these brain and behavioral changes that occur during this time in the lifespan, but what triggers it? So something that we're really interested in exploring is the role of puberty and gonadal hormones in coordinating those changes, which are much easier to study in mice. We also look at how things like exposure to drugs like cannabis during adolescence may alter the trajectory of brain development. So given that we've been introduced to the dual systems model, I just want to highlight a couple of things that we're looking at. So I mentioned changes in the prefrontal cortex maturation. Instead of looking at gray matter volume and thickness, we can delve into the individual neuron level and measure things like synaptic contacts onto neurons that project from the prefrontal cortex to the ventral striatum. And so we're seeing here some dendritic spines on a virally labeled neuron. We can also go in and record neural activity. We're looking at a trace of spiking from an individual neuron on the left. In terms of the striatum, my lab studies the striatum as well. What I'm showing you here is that we can monitor activity in the ventral striatum, in this case, looking at changes in dopamine release and signaling while animals are performing behaviors, say, to earn rewards. And we can compare how that looks in an adolescent mouse versus an adult. So I hope I gave you an idea about how we think that the difference in the pace of maturation between the prefrontal cortex and ventral striatum may explain adolescent behavior, and gives you a little insight into what might be driving Max Fischer's behavior in Rushmore. And with that, I will thank you and just plug my lab. And if you're interested in learning more about adolescent brain development, the UCLA Center for the Developing Adolescent has great resources online. Thanks.